Aerial warfare is brutal, but what happens when a nation runs out of options, out of planes, out of ships, out of time, and decides the only weapon left is its own people? This is the chilling story of Japan's last-ditch gamble in World War II. A tactic born not from strategy, but from desperation, where pilots took off knowing they'd never return. It was a move so extreme it haunted survivors for decades, even though it ultimately failed. So, what exactly happened? What were these planes like? And why did Japan send its young men on one-way missions, escorting the Americans straight to the gates of heaven? The story of perhaps one of the craziest air tactics in history began in late 1944, when Imperial Japan was cornered. And if you're wondering how they got there, well, it began with this. December 7th, 1941. Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, and in just under 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were killed, and another 1,178 were wounded. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, hundreds of aircraft ruined, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet was left stunned, confused, and mad beyond reason. But why? Well, the attack wasn't random. Actually, it was far from it. Japan was facing severe economic sanctions, including a U.S.-led oil embargo that threatened to choke its military operations. Oil at the time was a lifeline for Japan, and rather than back down, Japanese leaders chose to strike first, hoping to weaken U.S. naval power long enough to secure key territories across the Pacific. But here's the thing, instead of keeping America out of the war, the attack brought the U.S. in and set off a brutal conflict in the Pacific that would only escalate from there. In what many would call pure vengeance, the once mighty Imperial Navy was soon gutted by years of relentless American pressure. Let me paint the picture. In 3 years, strategic islands like Saipan, Guam, and even the Philippines were falling like dominoes. The U.S. forces, fueled by vengeance for Pearl Harbor, unmatched industrial power, and air superiority, were closing in through the Pacific, one brutal step at a time. To make matters worse, Japan's oil reserves were drying up, and its air force was now a shadow of itself, outgunned, outnumbered, and by all means outclassed. And as if the tension wasn't high enough, then came Leyte Gulf. Taking place in October 1944, this was the largest naval battle in history and Japan's final gamble to turn the tide. Sadly for the imperial nation, it failed catastrophically. In 4 days, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The Imperial Navy, which was once feared across the Pacific, was effectively dead in the water. And the Philippines, which was a critical lifeline to Southeast Asian resources, was severed from Japanese control. There would be no resupply, no reinforcement, no chance. Only a chilling idea born from the depths of desperation. Facing imminent defeat, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, made a desperate proposal: Suez attacks. The idea was that if Japan couldn't match American ship for ship or plane for plane, it could turn its pilots into human missiles. 1 plane, 1 pilot, 1 ship. That was the math. And just like that, in October 1944, the Kamikaze, which translates to divine wind, was born. According to Onishi, there is no other way to swing the war in our favor than to resort to kamikaze operations. You are the gods who will save Japan. Inspirational, sure, but behind those words was a brutal offer. Sacrifice 20,000 young men to sink enough ships, stall the American advance, and maybe, just maybe, force a negotiated peace. It was not a strategy. It was survival dressed in ritual. A last bloody card played by a nation that had run out of time, options, and hope. A plan that would be carried out by these planes. You see, with fuel, pilots, and aircraft in short supply, Japan had to become creative. And in a show of gut-wrenching engineering, they began transforming their aging fleet into human-guided missiles. You heard that right. Planes that were once designed to soar in dogfights or drop bombs became flying coffins with one goal: take out American ships at any cost, even if that cost was the pilot's life. Japan's existing aircraft were the first to undergo this grim transformation. And just like that, the famous fast, nimble Mitsubishi A6M0 that was once revered by its pilots took on a new narrative. Before now, this plane was a force to be reckoned with, but by 1944, it was outclassed by newer American fighters. And so, instead of retiring it, Japan modified the Zero for kamikaze roles, throwing out its guns, radios, and even landing gear and replacing them with 250 kilograms or 500 kilograms bombs and extra fuel. Without the burden of returning home, the Zero became a high-speed projectile. But they didn't stop there, because after the Zero came the Nakajima Kai-43 Hayabusa, also known as the Oscar. This was the Imperial Army's answer to the Zero. Light and agile, but poorly armored, the Hayabusa 2 was gutted and repurposed. But describing these planes doesn't capture the horror. These pilots took off with massive bombs beneath them, knowing they'd never land. For the Japanese, the Hayabusa was a massive improvement, as the plane's light frame made it perfect for slipping through defenses in the event that it actually got close enough. As time went on, the Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, which had already carved a name for itself during the attack on Pearl Harbor, also became a tool of self-harm. And this was because its precision diving capabilities made it ideal for kamikaze strikes. Modified Vals carried heavier bombs and no longer had to worry about pulling up after a dive. They were built to finish in a fireball. Now you have to understand, these planes weren't just tactical adaptations, they were psychological weapons. Each kamikaze plane symbolized a pilot's final sacrifice, delivering destruction with chilling finality. Stripped of survival gear, their airframes were reduced to essentials: an engine, wings, a cockpit, and of course, a bomb. But here's the thing, Japan didn't stop with modifying fighters and bombers. They wanted something faster and deadlier, and made purely for kamikaze strikes. Now, that sentence alone sounds insane, but it led to the creation of the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, which ironically literally means cherry blossom. Sure, the Allies mockingly called it baka, meaning fool in Japanese, but the Ohka wasn't a plane in the traditional sense, it was a manned missile. Carried beneath a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, the Ohka would be dropped 20 to 30 miles from its target. Once released, the pilot would glide toward the fleet and then ignite 3 solid-fuel rocket boosters, propelling the craft to speeds over 600 miles per hour in a straight-line death dive. In a war without insanely technical guided missiles, this was the terrifying next best thing. The Yokosuka was truly frightening, and the warhead packed into its nose was a monstrous 1,200 kilogram explosive charge. For context, this was more than double the payload of a converted Zero. Scary, yes, but effective? Well, not really, because the Ohka had a serious flaw. It couldn't take off on its own, its maneuverability was poor, and its range was painfully short. Worst of all, the Betty bombers that carried it were slow and lightly armored, meaning they were often shot down before they could release their deadly cargo. Still, if an Ohka hit its target, the result was catastrophic, so much so that one was enough to outright cripple a destroyer. Whether a converted fighter or a rocket-powered Ohka, these aircraft shared one cold mechanical truth. They were not built to come back. No landing gear, no armor, no parachutes. Just enough instrumentation to aim, dive, and explode. Their design logic was ruthless. Weight savings meant more fuel or a bigger bomb. Speed was prioritized over survivability, and as you would expect, the very sight of an aircraft refusing to pull up, even under heavy fire, left a psychological scar on the defenders below. Now, you would think these planes were the scariest things in the air at the time, and to a degree you'd be right, but these planes didn't operate in a vacuum, and that, perhaps, was scarier. By 1945, the US Navy had turned the Pacific into an aerial meat grinder. Combat air patrols flown by squadrons of Grumman F-6F Hellcats, Vought F-4U Corsairs, and even FM-2 Wildcats prowled the skies above the fleet. These American fighters were faster, heavier, and better armed than the planes Japan was now sacrificing. Below them, radar-guided anti-aircraft fire created a deadly gauntlet. Cannons like the Bofors 40mm, and the Oerlikon 20mm chewed up incoming planes. Proximity fused shells exploded near their targets with terrifying precision. Basically, even if a kamikaze pilot dodged the CAP, he had to slip past anti-aircraft picket lines, as well as destroyers and cruisers stationed on the perimeter, ready to intercept. This wasn't a war, it was a bloodbath. The terrifying Ohka was especially vulnerable because its mothership had to fly dangerously close to Allied fleets. And even if the rocket-powered missile was released, it followed a predictable glide before ignition. Essentially, alert pilots and gunners could and often did take it out before it could do any damage, and the pilot, well, would never come back. On paper, the kamikaze strategy was chillingly efficient. One plane, one bomb, one ship. No return trip, no complex dogfighting, just a direct line between the pilot and the explosion. But in practice, it was a gruesome, desperate tactic born of strategic collapse. Most missions missed their mark. Japan's trained pilots were running out, the aircraft were outdated, the enemy was adapting, and worse, they kept sending them. The Ohka and its kamikaze siblings were not acts of bravery. They were the last gasp of a cornered empire, willing to trade lives for ships in a war it could no longer win. Built to crash, these planes made history not by flying, but by falling. Fast, hard, and irreversibly tragic. Between October 1944 and Japan's surrender in August 1945, around 3,800 to 4,000 kamikaze missions were flown, especially during the battles of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. These kamikaze attacks sank at least 34 Allied ships and damaged over 300, including major vessels like the USS St. Lo and USS Franklin. Okinawa alone saw over 1,900 kamikaze sorties. A single successful strike could disable a ship, kill hundreds, and disrupt operations. But the broader strategic effect was minimal, as the Allies had the capacity to quickly repair or replace damaged assets. For Allied sailors, the psychological toll was insane. I mean, the idea of facing attackers who wanted to die was terrifying and foreign. Ships had to remain on constant alert, particularly picket destroyers, which were prime targets. Crews endured weeks of nonstop tension, exhaustion, and trauma, especially during Okinawa. In fact, the image of planes diving relentlessly through flak haunted many long after the war. But here's the worst part. Despite their shock value, kamikaze missions were riddled with inefficiencies. In fact, only about 10 to 15% of attacks actually hit their targets. Many planes were downed by flak or fighter patrols, and the Ohka, the rocket-powered kamikaze craft, had even worse success due to its vulnerable motherships. Japan lost around 2,500 to 3,000 pilots and over 4,000 planes, resources it couldn't afford to waste. But what do you think? Were kamikaze strikes a stroke of desperate genius, turning the skies into a last-ditch battlefield? Or were they a heartbreaking waste of brave young pilots and precious machines thrown at an enemy already winning? Clever? Vicious? Both? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it, pilot to pilot. And hey, if vintage warbirds, strange tactics, and aviation what-ifs are your thing, throttle up and subscribe. This is Vintage Aviation, where history never flies straight and level.